I was living in Southern California. I was in nursing school at the time. And in California, everybody's from somewhere else, including me. I'm from Indiana. And I had collected people because I love diversity, so I knew people from countries all over the world. And several of them wore the tag of Muslim. And we all got along great. We all did the same things. But every now and then religion would come up. And they would take on this superior tone, us Muslims and you Christians. And I thought, how dare they think that way, that they think they're better than me, when they do the exact same things that I did. And some of them did a lot worse than what I was doing. So I decided I was going to prove it false. There was one in the group that was a little more quieter than the rest. So I decided I would ask him if he had any books on Islam. And he brought me a bag of books. And I could tell when he gave them to me, he really didn't think that I would be reading them. And I sat down with the Bible and the Quran and a book called Inquiries into Islam by Imam Jawad Chiri. And I read Chiri's book, and I would look to the Bible. It's like, the Bible doesn't say that. And I'd look, and sure enough, it was there, such as hijab, and let the woman be covered in Corinthians. And I'd look again. It's like, well, the Bible doesn't say that. And I would look, and sure enough, it would be there. And then one point, I thought I had it, because I looked, and it wasn't there. But it turned out it was just a typo. And it was verse 12 versus verse 14, and it really was there. So I was getting pretty frustrated. When I embraced Islam that day under the tree, nobody else was there, but Allah was witness enough for me. And it took me about a month before I had the nerve to speak up and tell my friends the decision I made. I was feeling very embarrassed what my intention was, and I realized as I was learning that my friends, even though they wore the tag of Muslim, they knew nothing about the religion. It was simply a tag they grew up with, a culture from whatever country they came from, because the things that I was reading were nothing at all what they were telling me. And the day that I said Shahada publicly, the very first thing that was said to me was, no, you don't want to do that. You don't know what you're talking about. No, you don't want to be Muslim. My first conversation as a public Muslim was defending Islam to Muslims. And I started pulling books out from all around my house saying, oh, I do know what I'm talking about. And the Quran says this, and this says this, and this says this. And they would throw argument after argument at me, particularly as I started trying to change my life. And when I started wearing hijab, that was a real mess. But everything that they threw at me, such as a woman only being worth half of that of a man, it made me, being the rebel that I am, do more research and realize that what they were saying wasn't true. And I found that everything that didn't set right with me turned out that it wasn't Islam, because Islam turned out to be absolutely beautiful, about the oneness of God. And it related it very much to my ancestors and some of the teachings that I'd had as a child growing up with Native American philosophy. It was 3.5 years until I met a practicing Muslim. I was alone with my books. It was just me and these books. I remember one year, I saw on the news that Ramadan had come. And I knew from the Quran, and I didn't have any how-to books. I just had a few books on fiqh. I had Najul Balaga. I had the Quran. And I heard on the news Ramadan came. So I know that means you fast. So I quit eating. Now this is Southern California in the summer. It was like 115 degrees. My car was black leather interior with no air conditioning. I was a poor nursing student at the time. And I was driving, and I started to pass out behind the wheel. And I thought to myself, I wonder if it would be cheating if I was to get up before dawn and eat something. So Allah taught me, suhoor. And the same thing about prayers. I didn't have anything. I knew I needed to pray, but I didn't know how to pray. And I'd seen on TV, some positions, and I knew there was prostrations involved. There was a verse in the Quran that really hit home to me, and I memorized it in English. And for those 3.5 years, that was my prayer. I would stand and I would recite that verse, and I would prostrate, and I would say Shahada, and I'd look to the left, and I'd look to the right. And, I wasn't so far off, was I? You could be the only person in the world, but if your heart is in the right place, Allah will lead you. That verse, by the way, was Ayatul Kursi. So, after I left California and I moved to Oklahoma, some of this is in the Reborn video. I don't know if some of you have seen it. But I was in Walmart and I saw a woman in hijab. So I started following her around the store. I mean, I'd found the masjid before that. I looked in the phone book and I walked in. And back then, these were the days of the Farah hairdos and the jeans and the little T-shirts. And I walked into the men's side of a Wahhabi masjid. Assalamu alaikum. And they very quickly escorted me outside and on the sidewalk. And they said, "What is your proofs?" And I said, "Well, Quran, Najul Balaga. Najul Balaga." So it didn't go too well. But then I saw that lady in the Walmart, and I followed her for about half an hour. And I would hide behind the clothes racks. And I'd look at her. And I realized she was noticing this crazy American woman following me. So I knew I had to say something before she called the police. So I went up to her and, "Assalamu alaikum." Alaikum salam. She didn't speak any English. She was from Saudi. But her husband was in the store and he spoke English. So her and I just sat there and smiled at each other till he showed up. And then we talked a bit and we exchanged numbers. And during that time, I was able to get a really good look at her. And the first time I visited her at her house, I was in hijab. Alhamdulillah. I had a hard time finding it. I'd gone to a cloth store and I tried all these different cloths. One time I got a piece that was like for a coat and it was like, "This can't be right, it's too heavy." And then another one, but it was see-through, and I said, "This isn't right." So finally I found one, and it was the perfect size, and it was lightweight, and you couldn't see through it. It was black with bright red tomatoes all over it. So my first hijab was a tomato hijab, but I was very proud of that scarf, My first jilbab was a Halloween ghoul costume. You do what you have to do. But alhamdulillah, if your heart is in the right place, Allah will lead you. And now here we are 30-some years later, and I've never looked back. Even though I didn't want it, Allah chose it for me. And through the purification of my life over time, that's when the happiness came. And finally, I reached the point that I was getting dressed one day, and I was looking in the mirror, and I said, "You know what? You're not a bad person." And I tell you, that's huge, to be able to feel that about yourself. And to know that that's what Allah brought me. And I'm very grateful. Alhamdulillah.